The forest trail twisted like a serpent through the towering pines, their thick canopies blocking most of the fading daylight. Firefighter Daniel Carter adjusted the straps of his backpack, his boots crunching against the damp leaves as he followed the group ahead. This was supposed to be a simple team-building retreat. A few firefighters from Milwaukee, Engine 7 hiking into the deep woods, sharing stories around a campfire and clearing their minds from the weight of their job. "Stay close to the path," warned Luke, their local trail guide. He was a wiry man with sun-leathered skin and sharp, watchful eyes. "And after sunset, whatever you do, don't look back." A few of the firefighters exchanged amused glances. "Sounds like a campfire ghost story," muttered Harris, a heavy-set man with a deep, booming laugh. "What happens if we do?" Luke didn't smile. He only tightened the grip on his walking stick and kept moving. Daniel felt a prickle of unease but pushed it aside. He had faced raging infernos, collapsed buildings, and life-or-death rescues. A hike in the woods shouldn't be unsettling. And yet, something about Luke's warning lingered in the back of his mind. The deeper they went, the denser the trees became, gnarled roots clawing at the soil like ancient fingers. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. The fading sunlight stretched long, distorted shadows across the ground. It felt as if the forest itself was watching. The group reached a small clearing just before nightfall. A cold breeze rustled the leaves, and the silence felt unnatural, as if the world beyond their camp had ceased to exist. "You weren't kidding about it getting creepy after dark," joked Vasquez, a young firefighter with a nervous chuckle. Luke tossed more wood onto the growing fire, his face unreadable. "This place has rules," he said. "Old ones, passed down long before my time. If you hear something behind you after sunset, keep walking. Don't turn. Don't look." The flames flickered as if responding to his words. "And if we do?" Daniel asked. Luke's jaw tightened. "Then you might not leave this forest the same way you entered it." A tense silence settled over the group. The fire crackled, sending embers swirling into the darkness beyond. For the first time that night, Daniel noticed how the shadows between the trees didn't quite move with the wind. A chill ran down his spine. Something was out there. The group had set up camp deep within Nicollet National Forest, a vast and ancient woodland stretching across northern Wisconsin. Miles away from the nearest town, the only signs of human presence were the faded markers of Bitter Hollow Trail, an old, lesser-known route that had fallen out of use decades ago. Daniel had done some research before the trip. Unlike the more popular hiking trails near Lakewood, Bitter Hollow had a reputation, one of eerie folklore and unexplained disappearances. Rangers rarely patrolled this far in. There were no cabins, no maintained pathways, just a winding, narrow trail vanishing into the towering pines and misty ravines. Now, under the dim glow of the fire, Daniel studied their surroundings. The forest felt wrong. The towering trees loomed like sentinels, their thick, knotted branches intertwining overhead to block out the sky. The ground was a tangled mess of damp leaves and twisted roots, as if the earth itself was reluctant to be disturbed. Strange fungi grew along fallen logs, unnaturally pale, almost glowing in the firelight. The scent of wet moss and decaying wood hung thick in the air. Something about Bitter Hollow felt untouched, like time had forgotten it. The deeper night settled in, the quieter everything became. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of the wind through the trees. "This place is giving me the creeps," Vasquez muttered, pulling his jacket tighter. Harris grinned, poking at the fire. "Come on, man, it's just a forest. What's gonna happen? Bigfoot gonna carry us off?" Luke sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the fire's reach. His silence was unsettling. "Why don't people hike this trail anymore?" Daniel asked, watching him closely. Luke exhaled slowly. "Because those who did either never came back or came back changed." The fire flickered violently. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and for the briefest moment, Daniel thought he heard it. Something shifting in the undergrowth just beyond their camp. Vasquez must have heard it too. He turned sharply, staring into the trees. "Did you?" "Don't look," Luke interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. The group froze. "Not after dark," he continued in a whisper. "If you hear something behind you, if you feel something watching, keep walking. Keep your eyes forward." Daniel's pulse quickened. He didn't believe in ghost stories, but the weight of Luke's words settled like a stone in his gut. And then, in the distance, somewhere deep in the forest, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right behind them. The sound came again, software, measured, closer. Daniel's breath hitched as he stared into the fire, heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to look, to confirm what his mind refused to accept. But Luke's warning rang in his ears. "If you hear something behind you, keep walking. Keep your eyes forward." The firelight cast flickering shadows across the circle of firefighters. Harris had gone stiff, and his usual smirk wiped clean from his face. Vasquez, pale and tense, gripped his knees, his fingers digging into the fabric of his pants. No one moved. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that made your skin crawl, that made the hairs on the back of your neck rise. Then, a whisper, low, breathy, unintelligible. It drifted through the air like a draft, curling around them. Daniel clenched his fists. He had faced blazing infernos, carried people through collapsing buildings. But this was different. This was something he couldn't fight, something unseen, something wrong. Harris swallowed hard, barely moving his lips. "Someone's messing with us, right?" Luke didn't respond. His face was a mask of grim concentration, his hands gripping his walking stick like a lifeline. Then Vasquez did the one thing he shouldn't have done. He turned his head. It was quick, just a reflex, a flick of his gaze toward the trees. But in that instant, his face twisted, his mouth parted in silent horror. His skin turned a sickly shade of white, and his pupils shrank to pinpricks. Daniel barely had time to react before Vasquez screamed. A raw, guttural sound ripped from his throat as he scrambled backward, knocking over his camping chair and falling onto the dirt. His hands clawed at his face as if trying to erase whatever he had seen. "Vasquez!" Daniel lunged toward him, grabbing his shoulders. "What the hell? What did you see?" Vasquez only gasped, his breath coming in ragged, terrified sobs. His lips trembled, but no words came. Luke was already on his feet, voice like steel. "We have to move. Now." Harris looked at him in disbelief. "Move? Where? We're in the middle of the damn woods." Luke didn't answer. Instead, he bent down, forcing Vasquez to look at him. "You looked, didn't you?" Vasquez shuddered violently. His mouth opened, but only one word escaped. "Wrong." Daniel felt a pit open in his stomach. Then, the footsteps returned. Only now, they weren't behind them anymore. They were inside the campsite. The fire flickered violently, casting erratic shadows as the footsteps circled the camp. They were no longer behind them. They were here. Daniel's fingers tightened around Vasquez's arm, trying to ground him, to snap him out of whatever horror had paralyzed him. But Vasquez wasn't moving, just shivering violently, his breath shallow, his eyes unfocused. Harris shot up from his seat, his gaze darting wildly. "I don't see anything. Who the hell is out there?" Luke's voice came sharp as a blade. "Sit down." Harris flinched, but he didn't obey. His firefighter instincts were taking over. Assess, react, confront. But this wasn't a fire. This wasn't something they could fight. Daniel knew it. He could feel it in his bones. The air inside the camp felt wrong, thick, heavy, like walking into a burning building filled with smoke, except there was no fire, no heat. just a presence pressing against his skin. Then came the whisper. Not words. Just a sound, like something trying to form speech, but failing. Harris finally snapped. He spun toward the noise, his body rigid. Enough of this! Show yourself! Daniel barely had time to react before Harris looked. A strangled gasp tore from Harris's throat. His body recoiled as if something had physically struck him. His knees buckled, his breath hitched. Daniel grabbed his arm. Harris, what do you see? Harris's lips moved, but no words came, just a quiet, pitiful whimper. His wide, terrified eyes locked onto something Daniel couldn't see, and his entire body trembled with a horror too deep to describe. Luke didn't hesitate. Everyone, get up, now! Vasquez and Harris were still dazed, but Daniel forced them to their feet. He could hear it now, the rustling beyond the fire, the unseen movement closing in. Luke motioned for them to follow. Single file. Don't stop. Don't turn. We head back to the main trail. Daniel didn't argue. Something was here, something they weren't meant to see. They moved quickly, the fire shrinking behind them. The darkness between the trees felt denser now, the silence unnatural. Every step forward felt wrong, like the forest itself was resisting their escape. Then from behind them, a voice, not a whisper, not the wind, a clear human voice, raspy, broken, yet unmistakable. Daniel! Daniel's blood turned to ice. It had said his name, and it had come from right behind him. His body screamed to turn, to confirm what his mind refused to believe. But Luke's warning thundered in his head. Don't look back! Vasquez stumbled, whimpering. Harris was muttering under his breath. The trail was stretching ahead, but it felt endless, as if they weren't making any progress. Then just behind them, the voice came again, closer now. Daniel, help me. And that's when he recognized it. The voice wasn't something unknown. It wasn't some nameless horror. It was his own. Daniel's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The voice had been his own. Every rational part of his mind screamed that it was impossible, but the sound of it, hoarse, desperate, was unmistakable. It had come from right behind him, whispering through the darkness like a dying echo. Still, he didn't turn. Luke led the way, moving fast, his posture rigid with tension. Harris and Vasquez stumbled behind him, barely keeping up. Daniel forced himself to move, his legs feeling heavier with every step. The trail that had been clear earlier now seemed distorted, like the trees had shifted while they weren't looking. The forest was changing. And then, crunch. A heavy footstep landed directly behind him. Daniel's body tensed, his instincts warring with his fear. Keep walking. Don't stop. Don't look. Another step, closer. Then his own voice, weak, breaking, called out again. Daniel! Wait! It was barely above a whisper, but he could hear everything in it. The exhaustion, the pleading, the pain. His stomach twisted violently. It sounded like he was dying, his hands clenched into fists. He had trained for years to respond to cries for help. It was ingrained in him, the instinct to turn back, to save whoever was calling for him. Even now, his mind tried to reason with itself. What if it was someone lost? What if someone else was trapped here? But no, that was his voice, and something was using it. Vasquez choked on a sob as he stumbled forward, gripping the fabric of Luke's sleeve. It's still there, he gasped. It's right behind us. Daniel's vision blurred with adrenaline. He felt it now, not just the sound, but the weight of something pressing against his back, something unseen, just inches away. The thing that had whispered his name. It was keeping pace with him, mocking him. A slow, cold dread crawled up his spine. Then Luke spoke. It's trying to trick you. His voice was firm, but something in it wavered. He knew what was happening, had seen it before. It knows your mind, Luke continued, never slowing his pace. It'll sound like someone you love. It'll sound like someone in pain, but it's not real. Daniel gritted his teeth, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The weight behind him pressed closer. Then, a hand brushed his shoulder. His stomach dropped. The sensation was light, barely there, but it sent a cold shock through his entire body. Harris let out a strangled noise of fear. "Luke, don't react, don't stop. Just keep moving." But Daniel could barely hear him now, because the voice behind him wasn't whispering anymore. It was laughing. Low, ragged, wrong, and worst of all, it sounded exactly like him. The laughter slithered through the trees, twisting and breaking like a distorted echo of Daniel's own voice. His breath hitched. Every part of him screamed to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the very earth beneath him was trying to keep him here. The unseen presence was so close now, its breath, if it even breathed, felt like ice against the back of his neck. Luke's voice cut through the madness. "The trailhead is close. Don't stop. Don't turn." Daniel forced his eyes forward. The trees had thinned just ahead, revealing the faintest glow of moonlight beyond the forest's edge. The Bitter Hollow Trail was almost behind them. Almost. Vasquez stumbled, his footing lost on the uneven ground. He fell hard, his hands sinking into the damp earth. I can't. And then from behind him, a voice, his own voice, spoke again. "Just look, Daniel." It was calm now, persuasive, gentle. "Look at me." Daniel's fingers twitched. His breathing came in sharp bursts, panic gripping him like a vice. It was so easy. Just one glance, just a flick of his eyes. Then a realization hit him. That was the trick. That was the rule. It couldn't touch him, not fully, not completely, unless he gave it permission. Unless he looked. The moment he did, it would own him. Vasquez moaned weakly on the ground, shaking. "It's right behind me," he whimpered. "I can feel it." Luke turned back, grabbed Vasquez by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. "You want to see it?" he snarled. "That's how it gets you. But you're stronger than it. Move!" The trees groaned in protest as if something was shifting within them. Daniel saw it now, branches bending in unnatural ways, shadows stretching toward them like reaching fingers. And then the thing spoke again. "You know me, Daniel." His stomach twisted. He didn't know what it was, but somehow, deep in his gut, it knew him. Luke shoved Vasquez forward. "Run!" They did. Harris was the first to break into a sprint, Vasquez stumbling behind him. Luke kept pace beside Daniel, his knuckles white as he gripped his walking stick. The laughter behind them grew louder, closer, hungry. Daniel's lungs burned as the forest's edge drew nearer. The trees parted just enough to reveal the trailhead sign, a weathered, rotting post barely visible in the dim light. They were almost there. Then for the first time, Luke hesitated. Daniel caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the briefest pause in his step. That's when he understood. Luke had heard something too, something meant for him. Daniel grabbed his arm. "Don't!" Luke flinched. His gaze locked forward again, his jaw clenching as they burst through the last of the trees. And then the sound stopped. No laughter, no footsteps, nothing. The forest was silent again. They didn't stop running until they reached the road, where their parked truck sat in eerie stillness beneath the moon. Harris collapsed to his knees, his hands shaking. Vasquez looked pale as death. Luke just stood there, staring back at the tree line. Daniel turned, his heart still hammering. The trees loomed in the distance, dark and watchful. But whatever had followed them, whatever had whispered his name, hadn't crossed the threshold. It stayed behind, watching, waiting. Luke exhaled slowly. It doesn't leave the forest. No one spoke. No one asked questions. They simply got in their trucks, started the engines, and left Bitter Hollow Trail behind. But as Daniel drove, his grip tight on the wheel, one thought refused to leave his mind. That thing, it had spoken to him, and it had laughed in his voice, like it already knew something he didn't, like this wasn't over. Thanks for watching Brave Sparks. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more powerful and inspiring stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next one.